All right, welcome. We are on the fourth video in the reading of Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology on the Masks of God series. We're still in the prologue titled Toward a Natural History of the Gods and Heroes, and we're in part 3, the Dialogue of Scholarship and Romance, and we're going to pick up on page 13, where we talk about the chronology here of discoveries. So, a sense of the import of these new discoveries for the 19th century image of man can be gained from a summary schedule of a number of representative moments. For example, 1821, Jean-François Champollion derived from the Rosetta Stone the key to Egyptian hieroglyphics, thus unveiling a civilized religious literature earlier than the Greek and Hebrew by about 2,000 years. 1833, William Ellis, Polynesian Researches, 4 volumes, opened to view the myths and customs of the South Sea Islands. 1839, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, Algic Researches, 2 volumes, offered the first considerable collection of North American Indian myths. 1845 to 1850, Sir Austen Henry Layard excavated ancient Nineveh and Babylon, opening the treasuries of the Mesopotamian civilization. 1847 to 1865, Jacques Boucher de Crevecoeur de Perthes, Antiquities Celtiques et Antediluviennes, 3 volumes. Again, I'm not a French speaker, so pardon my pronunciation. Established the existence of man in Europe in the Pleistocene period, that is to say, more than 100,000 years ago, and on the basis of his classification of flint tools, identified 3 Old Stone Age periods, which he termed 1. The Cave Bear Age, 2. The Mammoth and Woolly Rhinoceros Age, and 3. The Reindeer Age. 1856, Johann Karl Fuhlrott discovered in a cave in eastern Germany the bones of Neanderthal man, Homo neanderthalensis, mighty hunter of the cave bear and mammoth ages. 1859, Charles Darwin's great work on the origin of species appeared. 1860 to 1865, Edouard Lartet in southern France unearthed the remains of Cro-Magnon man, by whom Neanderthal man had been displaced in Europe during the Reindeer Age at the end of the Pleistocene. 1861, the Popol Vuh, an ancient Central American mythological text, was introduced to the learned world by the Abbé Brassoir du Bourbourg. From this momentous decade of the 60s onward, the universality of the basic themes and motifs of mythology was generally conceded, the usual assumption being that some sort of psychological explanation would presently be found, and so it was that from 2 remote quarters of the learned world, the following comparative studies appeared simultaneously. 1868. In Philadelphia, Daniel G. Britton's The Myths of the New World, comparing the primitive and high culture mythologies of the Old World and the New. And in Berlin, Adolf Bastians Das Beständige in den Menschenrassen und die Spielwitte ihrer Veränderlichkeit. Not a German speaker either. Applying the point of view of comparative psychology and biology to the problems first of the constants and then of the variables in the mythologies of mankind. 1871. Edward B. Tylor, in his Primitive Culture, researches into the development of mythology, philosophy, religion, language, art, and custom, directed a psychological explanation of the concept of animism to a systematic interpretation of the whole range of primitive thought. 1872 to 1885. Heinrich Schliemann, excavating Troy, Hissarlik, and Mycenae, probed the pre-Homeric, pre-classical levels of Greek civilization. 1879. Don Marcelino de Sautuola discovered on his property in northern Spain, Altamira, the magnificent cave painting of the Mammoth and Reindeer ages. 1890. Sir James George Fraser published the culminating work of this whole period of anthropological research, The Golden Bough. 1891 to 1892. In central Java, on the Solo River near Trinil, Eugene Dubois unearthed the bones and teeth of the missing link Pithecanthropus erectus, the ape-man who walks erect, with a brain capacity halfway between that of the largest brained gorilla, about 600 cc's, and that of the average modern man, about 1,400 cc's. 1893. Sir Arthur Evans commenced his Cretan excavations. 1898. Leo Frobenius announced a new approach to the study of primitive cultures, the Kulturkreislehre, culture area theory, wherein he identified a primitive cultural continuum extending from Equatorial West Africa eastward through India and Indonesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, across the Pacific to Equatorial America and the Northwest Coast. This was a radical challenge to the older parallel development or psychological schools of interpretation, such as Brinton, Bastian, Tylor, and Fraser had represented, inasmuch as it brought the broad and bold theory of a primitive transoceanic diffusion to bear upon the question of the distribution of so-called universal themes. And so it was that during that epochal century of almost unbelievable spiritual and technological transformations, the old horizons were dissolved, and the center of gravity of all learning shifted from the little areas of local pride to a broad science of man himself in his new and single world. The older 18th century disciplines, which formerly had seemed to fill sufficiently the field of humanistic concern, have become but provinces of a much larger subject. Whereas formerly the prime question seemed to have been that of man's supernatural as against merely natural endowment, now, with the recognition of the universality of those mythological themes that formerly had been taken as evidence of the divine source of the higher religions, surpassing man's natural knowledge, as St. Thomas Aquinas argued, and therefore proving that God is far above all that man can possibly think of God, with the realization that these supernatural motifs were not peculiar to any single tradition, but common to the religious lore of mankind, the tension between orthodox and Gentile, high and primitive, simply dissolved. And the major questions, the problems of man's highest concern, now became first, whether such mythological themes as death and resurrection, the virgin birth, and creation from nothing should be rationally dismissed as mere vestiges of primitive ignorance, superstitions, or on the contrary, interpreted as rendering values beyond the faculty of reason, transcendent symbols. And second, whether as products of the spontaneous operations of the psyche, they can have appeared independently in various quarters of the world, theories of parallel development, or rather as the inventions of particular times and persons, must have been spread about either by early migrations or by later commerce, theories of diffusion. Few in the 19th century were competent to face either of these questions without prejudice, or to control the necessary evidence for their analysis. For the psychology of the time had simply not come into the possession either of the information or of the hypotheses necessary for a probing of the psyche in depth. The eminent physiologist, psychologist, and philosopher Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920, who in 1857 began lecturing at Heidelberg and in 1875 at the University of Leipzig, masterfully reviewed the whole ethnological field from a psychological point of view in his numerous works on ethnological psychology. Völkerpsychologie. But he realized and frankly averred that the breadth and depth of this richly promising subject had not yet been adequately measured. A scientific probing of the psyche in depth, however, had already been initiated at the neurological clinic of Salpêtrière in Paris, again, not a French speaker, where Jean-Martin Charcot, 1825 to 1893, professor of pathological anatomy in the medical faculty of the university, was opening new horizons in his studies of hysteria, paralysis, brain disease, senility, and hypnosis. The young Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, and Carl G. Jung, born 1875, were among his pupils, and something of the force and direction of his researches may be judged from their distinguished careers in exploration of the dark, inaccessible reaches of the psyche. However, the application of the new realizations concerning the phenomenology of the unconscious, of the neurotic individual, to a systematic interpretation of ethnological materials had to wait for the 20th century movement initiated by Jung's Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, 1912, and Freud's Totem und Tabu, 1913. The orientations and researches of Wundt and Charcot prepared the way, but the full-scale application of the laws and hypotheses of the science of the unconscious to the fields of religion, prehistory, mythology, and folklore, literature, and the history of art, which has been one of the outstanding factors in the development of 20th century thought, we find only suggested as a richly promising possibility in the science of their day. And yet, as Thomas Mann observed in his important speech on Freud and the future, delivered in Vienna on the occasion of Dr. Sigmund Freud's 80th birthday, the profound and natural sympathy between the two spheres of literature and the science of the unconscious had for a long time existed unperceived. The romantic The romantic biologic fantasies of Novalis, 1772 to 1801, Schopenhauer's dream psychology and philosophy of instinct, 1788 to 1860, the Christian zeal of Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855, which had led him to extremes of penetrating psychological insight, Ibsen's view of the lie as indispensable to life, 1828 to 1906, and above all, Nietzsche's translation of the metaphysical pretensions of theology, mythology, and moral philosophy into the language of empirical psychology, 1844 to 1900. These not only anticipated, but in scope and richness sometimes even surpassed, the wonderful insights that were now being coolly systematized in the formidable hypotheses and terminologies of scientific exactitude. In fact, as Mann suggested in his somewhat ironical praise of the eminent scientist whose scientific exactitude had not permitted him to regard philosophy very highly, it might with justice even be claimed that the modern science of the unconscious no more than writes the quod erat demonstratum to the whole great tradition of metaphysical and psychological insights represented by the romantic poets, poet-philosophers, and artists, who throughout the course of the 19th century had walked step by step alongside the men of analytical knowledge and experience. One thinks of Goethe, in every line of whose Faust there is evident a thoroughly seasoned comprehension of the force of the traditional symbolism of the psyche, in relation not only to individual biography, but also to the psychological dynamics of civilization. One thinks of Wagner, whose masterworks were conceived in a realization of the import of symbolic forms, so far in advance of the allegorical readings suggested by the Orientalists and ethnologists of his time, that even with the dates before one, Wagner 1813 to 1883, Max Müller 1823 to 1900, Sir James George Fraser 1854 to 1941. It is difficult to think of the artist's work as having preceded the comparatively fumbling efforts of the men of science to interpret symbols. One thinks of Melville, 1819 to 1891, captured by cannibals on the South Sea island of Nukahiva, and even scheduled to become an item on the menu, in whose Moby Dick, 1851, and Pierre, 1852, the profundity of the author's psychological insight is rendered through an infallible use of the language of symbol. The myth, as Thomas Mann has seen, and as many of the depth psychologists would agree, is the foundation of life, the timeless schema, the pious formula into which life flows when it reproduces its traits out of the unconscious. But on the other hand, as any ethnologist, archaeologist, or historian would observe, the myths of the differing civilizations have sensibly varied throughout the centuries, and broad reaches of mankind's residence in the world, indeed to such a degree that the virtue of one mythology has often been the vice of another, and the heaven of one the other's hell. Moreover, with the old horizons now gone that formerly separated and protected the various culture worlds and their pantheons, a veritable Götterdämmerung has flung its flames across the universe. Communities that once were comfortable in the consciousness of their own mythologically guaranteed godliness find abruptly that they are devils in the eyes of their neighbors. Evidently, some mythology of a broader, deeper kind than anything envisioned anywhere in the past is now required. Some arcanum arcanorum, far more fluid, more sophisticated than the separate visions of the local traditions, wherein those mythologies themselves will be known to be but the masks of a larger, all their shining pantheons but the flickering modes of a timeless schema that is no schema. But that precisely is the great mystery pageant only waiting to be noticed as it lies before us, so to say, in sections, in the halls and museums of the various sciences yet already living, too, in the works of our greatest men of art. To make it serve the present hour, we have only to assemble or reassemble it in its full dimension scientifically, and then bring it to life as our own in the way of art, the way of wonder, sympathetic, instructive delight, not judging morally, but participating with our own awakened humanity in the festival of the passing forms. And that concludes the prologue to Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology. Next time, we'll get into part 1, the psychology of myth. Thank you for joining me, and enjoy your day.